Re-Zero, Arc 7, Chapter 77, Twist of Fate.
Otto, this is a report on the damage caused by the attack of the flying dragons. Emilia lowered her eyebrows painfully at Otto's explanation as he tapped the documents close at hand. The fortress city of Garrel had been hit by a flying dragon cataclysm. Several days had passed with them repairing the city and dealing with the injured, until it could be said that things had settled down for the moment, the results of which had thereafter become clear. From Emilia's point of view, the city was in a terrible state. The splendid defensive wall that surrounded the city has been destroyed, and the numerous boulders that were dropped from on high were still scattered around the city. The damage to the buildings was extensive, less than half of them having survived unscathed. A fair number of people had died, and the house where Emilia and her group were sleeping, with its second floor collapsed, was one where its residents who'd return were gone. Emilia, if only they had rushed there just a little bit sooner. Such regrets kept poking at Emilia's chest like sharp needles. However, Otto, it's pointless to speculate whether we could have rushed here earlier, so let's quit with that. Otto was able to read Emilia's thoughts, but he cut her off immediately. Emilia's face dropped at his sharpness, but Otto gave a curt nod with his chin, indicating the outside of the window. Otto, back then, the reason we allowed this to take priority was because a group of flying dragons passed by us overhead. Without that, we wouldn't have had the option to hurry. In other words, Emilia, in other words, Otto, there was nothing we could have done to prevent it, you know. It's a matter of cause and effect. You can't have one without the other. It would be irrational to worry about that. Emilia gave Otto a strained smile as he slowly shook his head while explaining that his opinion felt like he'd read what Emilia truly felt inside, and that in itself was of no surprise. Otto was a very good judge of people, so that was normal for him. On top of that, she imagined Otto's words to her were his way of consoling her. He was telling her that worrying about what-if scenarios was not constructive consideration, and so Emilia was convinced. However, Petra, but the issue lies with how you said it. I hate the way you put it. Petra turned her face away in a huff, looking really upset. Sitting in a chair in front of Emilia, Petra was in the middle of combing her bright brown hair and polishing up to her usual cuteness. This role was one Emilia had been entrusted with lately, but Petra's attitude of never skimping out on taking care of herself, even during their journey, was one that always left her impressed. She must have been exhausted from running around the city yesterday, but now that a new day had come, she was properly remodeling herself into a new self. That too was a boon of Petra's awareness of her position and sense of responsibility. After all, she was, Otto. To hear that from our mistress, Lady Petra, is very upsetting. As Otto remarked, Petra was in charge of organizing Emilia's group as the lady employing them. Emilia's group had entered the Wallachian Empire in search of Subaru and Rem, who had disappeared. After many twists and turns and various hardships, they arrived in the Empire, but as they had expected, it was difficult to cross the border by regular means, and they ended up smuggling themselves into the country. In doing so, they had to use aliases and fabricate a full story about the purpose of their journey, since things would get bad if Emilia and Roswell's true identities were discovered. As a result, Emilia was assigned the role of Emily, the guardian escort, and the ones she had to protect were Emilia, Lady Petra and Lady Beatrice. Otto, the reason we came to the Empire was to restore Lady Beatrice's health. And this is a goal that will actually be fulfilled once we collect what we're after, so it's not entirely a lie. Petra, I understand, but somehow. You know it's fine after all. Otto, you stopping halfway's got me concerned, so it would be better if you just told me. Petra, I suppose? Like you know Otto-san, could it be Master's bad habits are spreading to you? Emilia, I knew you shouldn't have asked. Otto had ended up cradling his head in his hands, so Emilia hastily retracted the words she was about to say. Otto looked really uncomfortable with it, but as for Emilia, she found Roswell's intelligence to be very dependable. So it was very encouraging to see two of the smartest people in the camp thinking alike, although it seemed that saying that would cause Otto even more undue suffering. Anyhow, Emilia, we've also got far less injured people in the city thanks to Garfield. Yeah, Otto, that is, without a doubt, true, and I think it is a great credit to Lady Petra, Frederica-san, and of course you, Emily, for helping out." At Otto's nodded response, Emilia could finally release the tension in her cheeks. Garfield's hard work, Frederica and Petra's help, all made Emilia proud. It was a struggle of which she and her dear friends could be very proud of. "Emilia, Otto-kun did a really good job of talking with Zika-san and the others, too." "Otto, fortunately, Zika-san was a person who can be reasoned with, so the difficulties were minimal. I am also grateful to Maizelda-san, who I happened to run into, and she was able to run me through everything." "Petra, Otto-san's face is Maizelda-san's favorite, isn't it?" "Otto, I have never had someone be so open about something like that, so I was quite perplexed." Otto gave a strained smile at Petra, who held up her small fist with a grin. Maizelda, with whom Emilia also exchanged words, was a very strong and kind woman. She had been kind to them from the beginning of their acquaintance and had shown them a lot of consideration, although part of her wondered why Otto and Garfield were being treated differently. "Emilia, I know she likes Otto-kun's face, but Garfield is cute, too." "Petra, maybe it's because Garf-san often has wrinkles between his eyebrows and nose. Also, perhaps it's because he is annoyed at being separated from Ramne-sama." "Otto, I'm going to go ahead and not say anything at all." Petra, placing her finger properly on her own shapely nose, gave this appraisal of Garfield. Emilia thought that Garfield's changing facial expressions were also charming, so she wanted Maizelda to look at Garfield more properly. All such digressions aside, "Emilia, but if the city's cleanup is getting close to finishing its first stage." "Otto, yes." Otto nodded at Emilia's words and then looked out the window once more. Ahead of Otto's gaze was the face of the city, standing still despite the damage the city hall. Gathering there were the influential people of the fortress city of Garrel. "In other words, Otto, finally, I think we can start talking about progressing things forward." And as Otto said, the discussion began. "Hey, you never thanked me, Pops." Ascending the walls of the half-destroyed city, Garfield called out to the back of the previous visitor. In honesty, they were not someone he wanted to call out to, but turning right back around the moment their back came into view would have made him feel like he had lost, so his competitive spirit won out over his disinclination. In the first place, why did he have to be the one to turn around? If anybody had to turn tail, unable to bear the awkwardness, it ought to be the other person, rather than himself. With that in mind, he had kicked things off with words like those of a punk, but, TCH, with the reply being a mighty click of the tongue. Garfield immediately regretted his choice. As a result of his stubbornness, he went through an even more unpleasant experience. Inside his head, he could hear Otto's reaction, of course of exasperation. Be that as it may, it was someone he was not fond of, although Garfield had not been present when this previous visitor had been disrespectful to his people. Upon hearing of it later, that affair had been more than enough to make him dislike the guy. That had been Garfield's unchanging impression of Heinkel Astria. Heinkel, in light leather armor, a fine sword at his hip, Heinkel stood guard. However, Garfield had come to judge it as more of a display to cover up that he had nothing to do and no place to be, rather than it being an admirable desire to keep the peace in the city. The scent of alcohol wafting from his back, the empty liquor bottles lying around him, were proof of that. During the Flying Dragon cataclysm, Heinkel had apparently gone on an utmost ferocious rampage against the advanced flock of flying dragons, yet came to suffer a painful defeat against a divine general. Nevertheless, the tiny Schelt had talked his head off in defense of Heinkel, but Utakata was frank, saying he couldn't do a thing. That probably was the truth. As evidence of this, among those Garfield had to deal with while going around performing healing magic on the wounded, Heinkel had been amongst the ones with the most severe injuries. The damage he had received had been quite hideous, so much so that he would probably still be bedridden without Garfield's healing magic. "Garfield, is that tongue clickin' supposed to be a thanks? Gee, that's hella different from the social etiquette my amazing self's aware of, oi." Even while bearing the other party's situation in mind, Garfield spat abuse. Garfield, too, had experienced defeat. He understood how frustrating it was, so he did not wish to heartlessly poke at the fact that he had been defeated. However, with the other party refusing to be polite, Garfield was tempted to make at least one snide comment. Not to mention that he did not have a favorable impression of Heinkel. Garfield, this is the Empire. There may be some social etiquette my amazing self ain't aware of, but you're from the kingdom, Hitcher? On top of that, you're the father of the Sword Saint, yeah? Heinkel, Garfield, as my amazing self said, he's one tough asshole. You'd think that someone that strong'd have great parents, but you didn't even have the decency to be polite. Heinkel, no matter how great the parents are, it doesn't mean their kids are just as great. Garfield looked daunted, having continued his sarcastic nagging towards a back that would not even turn around. He had assumed he would still be ignored, but an unexpected rebuttal had arrived. Garfield's eyes went wide, but Heinkel, still without turning around, said, Heinkel, and vice versa. There's no reason at all why the parents of a monster also have to be monsters. Garfield, oh, Heinkel, you're way too bad at hurling insults. If you want to provoke someone, take a lesson from Miss Priscilla. As you are, you failed. Garfield, Gark, his attempt to get the upper hand through insults was seen through, and was replied to in kind. Ultimately, having just been told what true provocation really was, Garfield faltered. As things were, the conversation was finished. But were he to turn his back and leave, he would be the one defeated in the true sense of the word. In the end, Garfield stuck around out of stubbornness, sitting a short distance away from Heinkel, gazing over the southern horizon devoid of the ramparts with which to guard the now defenseless city. Having been assailed by countless flying dragons, the walls of the famed fortress city of Garrel had been severely damaged. The damage yielded by the boulders thrown from a high altitude had been extensive, and although the crumbling, demolished walls were being repaired as fast as possible, the city's defensive abilities were considerably lowered. In particular, the city's southern wall had been the one to suffer the greatest damage. The western wall, which had borne the first attack, was also in a rather horrible state, but that was nothing compared to this. Forget about the wall, the entire area had been razed to the ground. Garfield, I heard that Emilia Summer. No, Emily and the princess they call Priscilla fought a divine general, but the ferocity of the battle could be perceived in clear terms, judging from the disastrous scene below them. Most of the buildings had not retained their original shape, and a terrible shockwave had mowed down anything and everything in its path. The battle with the Dragonkin, that which is one of the 9 divine generals, had its denouement orchestrated by a white light. Garfield, too, had been in the city when the shockwave blew him away. Emilia had explained what it had truly been. Garfield, a dragon's roar. While ground dragons, water dragons, flying dragons and the like were species of dragons, dragons were a cut above them. Dragons possessed power said to be beyond all reason. With merely a single breath, everything was uprooted. There was a fear that, had the duo of Emilia and Priscilla not strived to oppose it, the damage would have spread even further. Garfield, no matter what, my amazing self's always in the wrong place at the wrong time. As he praised Emilia and, while he was at it, Priscilla for their accomplishments, a bitter feeling brewed in his heart. By failing to accompany them to Pleiades' watchtower, Garfield had missed the chance to come face to face with the divine dragon Volcanica, who Emilia had met. Not only that, but this time he had missed the chance to come into contact with yet another dragon despite being in the same city. In a Subaru-like way of saying things, he had to say that the fish got off the hook. Heinkel, his sulking was not at all because he had been unable to meet a dragon, an existence that had been spoken of since ancient times. It was because Garfield's role was to fight and defeat powerful enemies. To defeat those who would try to disrupt the camp's goals, and to carry out his role as the head military officer. Going around treating the wounded was absolutely not a part of those duties. Garfield, more than that, my amazing self also couldn't do a thing when entering the Empire. In the act of smuggling themselves into the Walachian Empire, Garfield had been useless. They had relied on Otto's families, on the Suwin Trading Company, for getting into contact with the people that would guide them across the border. And when they got into a disagreement with them along the way, Petra had concluded negotiations in a dignified manner. After that, when problems arose as soon as they entered the Empire, Frederica used her own blood to overcome the situation, and all Garfield ultimately did was to knock out a guy he did not like, as to get him to shut up. At the very least he had found hope in the name of the black-haired Valkyrie, Natsumi Schwartz, who was rumored to be in the fortress city, but just when he had thought his reunion with Subaru would finally come to be, Garfield, just missing each other after the captain left. Unlucky till the very end, seems like absolutely everything was my amazing self's fault. Of course, he was fully aware that this was paranoia due to overthinking. Just as Garfield and the others had had a great adventure arriving in the Empire, Subaru, having been hurtled off into the Empire, had also been going on a great adventure there. Nothing more, nothing less, getting involved in a major incident straight away, even in a place he had been hurtled off to, was a situation that was very much like the Subaru that Garfield knew. Garfield, a scramble for the top of the Empire, that's one hell of a big deal, Captain. A sign of great war that would engulf the fortress city? No, that would engulf the entirety of the Wallachian Empire. What kind of causality had led to him being right in the middle of such a situation? However, Garfield thought, surely this was the result of Subaru being who he is. While eagerly, desperately struggling to return to his place beside Emilia and the others, he had bonded with the people he had encountered on the way, and unable to abandon them, he kept running. Right now, he was someplace far away, in a big city to the southeast, seemingly negotiating with influential people. Regardless of the outcome, it would be nice if he were to return safely. Heinkel, hey, brat, Garfield, Heinkel, your teeth have been clattering like hell for a while now. Can't you behave and shut your mouth? Heinkel suddenly spat those words at Garfield, who had been lost in thought. The seemingly annoyed red-haired man glaring his way put a finger in his own mouth and traced his canine in demonstration. That was to say that Garfield's habit of clacking his teeth was getting on his nerves. Garfield, why should my amazing self have to listen to anything you say? If it's that hard on the ears, you can leave whenever you want. Heinkel, is that your best insult, you petulant brat? I was here first. Know your place. Garfield, HK. The guy who chickened out against a divine general shouldn't be so arrogant. Loathing the idea of being cornered in the same way as before, Garfield forcefully shouted that back. After asserting that, Garfield realized he had made a rash remark. However, his opponent was his opponent. Retorting to such an extent, needing to feel guilty about that was, Heinkel, that's right, isn't it? I got scared. That's why, it turned out like this. Garfield, Pops, Heinkel, I also wrecked Miss Priscilla's mood, so now I'm getting dead drunk. How irredeemable. However, the words that Heinkel offered in return were weak, leaving Garfield puzzled. Lifting the bottle of alcohol in his hand to his mouth while he sipped its contents, Heinkel grumbled in a low voice which seemed to curse the world, seemed to curse his own being. Just as if the very world itself had abandoned him, his demeanor seemed to have fallen to utter desperation. Garfield, your opponent was a divine general. They're the Empire's strongest military force, snatchel you couldn't beat 'em. Pops, unable to stand watching that pathetic appearance, he vocalized that comfort. Despite having said it himself, Garfield was astonished by the fact he had made that remark without shame. Just before, he had verbally abused Heinkel for losing to a divine general, but now he was comforting him by saying it was natural for him to have lost. It was incoherent, and probably completely failed at being comforting. If Garfield had been in the same position as Heinkel, he might have flown into a fit of rage at being told the same thing. However, Heinkel gave a spineless laugh at Garfield's comfort. Heinkel, I may not have won, but I had a duty to carry out. All the more so if I'm to reap the benefits of going with Miss Priscilla. What a fucking masterpiece, Garfield. It's a masterpiece, Heinkel. The thing I've been chasing for over 10 years keeps slipping through my fingers. No matter how far I go, I'll never be able to change my piss-poor nature. At Heinkel's incessant self-derision, Garfield began to see him differently. At first, due to the reckless actions Heinkel had taken at the Watergate City, Garfield's impression of him had been enmity and disgust. After just a short period, the very moment he thought they had been affirmed, seeing Heinkel curse himself made Garfield reevaluate his impression. There stood a weak, exhausted, miserable man. The words that spewed from his mouth were blades to himself and to others, though their sharpness was pathetic. If those were only directed towards others, Garfield would merely scorn them and be done with it. However, when he realized Heinkel directed them at himself as well, Garfield felt an unpleasant sensation in his chest. Garfield, bastard, why'd you got the nerve to be rotten away like that? You're still living. Then, Heinkel. I wonder, why am I still alive? Garfield, HK, you really dare to say that in front of the person who saved you? Heinkel continued to grumble words of self-abandonment which invited Garfield's wrath. At Garfield's response, Heinkel glanced at him and muttered as if realizing it for the first time. Heinkel, now that you mention it, you were the one that healed me. Be careful next time. Garfield, Heinkel, don't miss the opportunity to abandon the guys you hate to spare yourself from future troubles. Heinkel gave a spineless chuckle as he asserted so. The moment he heard that, Garfield felt the sensation of his vision being stained a deep red, and he found himself clutching the man's collar and scowling at his face reeking of liquor from a close proximity. He heard a light smashing sound of a liquor bottle shattering by his feet. That was because Garfield had seized him by the collar and lifted his body up through sheer force, causing the liquor bottle, with its contents still remaining, to fall from Heinkel's hand to the bottom of the ramparts. Following the fallen liquor bottle with his gaze, Heinkel heaved a sigh. Heinkel, that's just a waste, isn't it? Garfield, bastard, is that all you got to say? Without resisting, Heinkel turned his lethargic eyes towards Garfield. His blue eyes, bereft of spirit, were of the same origin as that of both Reinhardt, whom Garfield had spoken to, and Wilhelm, whom he had gone under the gaze of. Nonetheless, Garfield could hardly believe that they were the same. Just how could human eyes become so dull? The emotions whirling in the utmost depths of those two eyes, over just how many months and years had they been degraded for? Garfield, the fuck's with that? Why are you looking at me like that? Heinkel said that he had displeased Priscilla, having suffered a loss against a divine general. The truth of the matter was unclear, but Garfield believed that it was far too inconsiderate to blame someone for lacking the power to be able to put up a good fight against a divine general. At least, that was Garfield's perspective, who had not arrived in time to have a chance to fight. At Garfield's gaze and words, Heinkel's eyes wavered slightly. His eyes, which had not even been focused on Garfield, the man right in front of him, finally connected with Garfield so that he was clearly reflected in them. And then, Heinkel, my wife. Regardless of the fact that he had just been gulping down alcohol, the lips of Heinkel, spilling out that hoarse voice, were parched. But, when he finally received words that held meaning, Garfield clenched his molars, and decided he would hear what the wavering man had to say beyond that. However, the words Garfield expected, yet again were not heard. Heinkel, Garfield, oi. Still being clutched by the collar, Heinkel's eyes lost focus of Garfield once more. His gaze went past Garfield, and directed themselves towards what lay behind him. Garfield thought that was frustrating and irritating. However, Heinkel, it's a horse carriage. Garfield could not help but turn around, at the words that had been spoken. Garfield, since he was grabbing Heinkel, Garfield's back was facing the south side of the city. From beyond that horizon, there was indeed a small contour that could be seen approaching their direction. Straining his eyes, even Garfield was unable to tell if it was a dragon carriage or a horse carriage, but if he believed Heinkel when he called it a horse carriage, that was Heinkel. So it's the honored return of the bunch who went out. Through different words, Heinkel affirmed the thoughts of Garfield, the latter catching his breath. The contour was still only the size of a fingernail, but its outline was becoming slightly more visible. That might be the carriage that the person Garfield was eagerly waiting and searching for was riding in. Heinkel, oi, let go of me, brat. Garfield's eyes sparkled with anticipation and excitement, an air of liquor-reeking breaths hanging over him. A frown crossed his face as he looked in front of him and was greeted by Heinkel's sullen look. The profile of a man who was just about to speak from his heart was no longer there, and all that was left was the face of a hateful man, spewing disgusting and reckless remarks to those around him. The moment he realized that, Heinkel tilted his neck and broke free from Garfield's hands. Garfield felt that was both an escape physically, and an escape emotionally. What should have been caught by the tips of his fingers, had coldly slipped away. Heinkel, the person you're waiting for seems to be coming. Why don't you hurry up and go meet them? Garfield, bastard, you. Heinkel, I'll serve my duty as a lookout. My job is to report it if I see something after all. Even if I'm drunk, I can at least do that much. though it's probably not going to score me many points." With a wave of his hand, Heinkel drunkenly staggered as he turned his back to Garfield. For a moment, he hesitated if he should call out to that back to try to stop him, but in the end no words came out. Just as Heinkel had pointed out, Garfield's heart had already started to get impatient. As soon as possible, he wanted to rush over to the contour approaching from beyond the horizon. Heinkel, it'd be tragic to miss the opportunity, wouldn't it? Those final words, you'll end up chasing them endlessly. Leaving just those words behind, Heinkel jumped off of the ramparts before Garfield. Surprisingly landing safely inside the city, he headed for the center of the city. That final comment, the earnest emotion contained therein, Heinkel had asserted that they would stab into Garfield's heart like a thorn. However, Garfield, now is, shelving the existence of that thorn for now. Garfield jumped down the opposite side of the ramparts that Heinkel had. Landing outside of the city, Garfield stretched out his bent knees and broke out into a vigorous spirit. His legs kicking off the ground like explosions, faster than even the wind, he ran directly for the oncoming contour. Garfield, Captain. Through the crevices in his sharp fangs, Garfield's unbearably deep emotions leaked out. It was intimidating to consider the feelings of Emilia, Beatrice, Petra, and the others, but Garfield was also one of the people who had been earnestly awaiting a reunion with Subaru. That was why, transforming his feelings of excitement into running strength, he headed for the carriage at a breakneck pace. Just a little further, just a few dozen more seconds of running, he would be reunited with Subaru, and Garfield. And so, those overflowing expectations turned to unexpected feelings of confusion. His speed, fast enough to leave the wind behind, came to slow down, and before long the wind overtook him. On the contrary, he became fast enough to leave everything except the wind behind, and finally came to a standstill. In Garfield's trembling emerald eyes, the single carriage that had come from beyond the horizon, no, the multitudes of carriages and ox carts that were approaching were reflected. Garfield, this is, hoping that he would be able to meet Subaru without hesitation, Garfield blinked his eyes. Considering the purpose for which Subaru and the others had departed from the fortified city, the current view was indeed one of the possibilities, but at that time, Garfield had not thought that far ahead. In any case, stopping in its tracks, before the overwhelmed Garfield, at the head of the convoy heading down the road towards the city, was the carriage drawn by an excellent Galewind horse which he had brazenly arrived at. And then, you, what are you fooling about for? If you are a messenger of the city, surely there is something you ought to be doing. So, examining his expression, the man in the Oni mask caused Garfield to catch his breath. You must be exhausted, Miss Frederica. At the aroma of the tea being gently offered to her tired and thirsty self, Frederica looked at the person's face with faint surprise, a smile on his gentle face. He who showed appreciation for Frederica was a man whose point of view was close to the ground. By nature, Frederica, who was tall in stature, often surpassed men in height, but even disregarding that, the one in front of her was a short person of a small build. However, over the course of several days, Frederica had recognized that in contrast to his height, he had a large heart, and possessed goodwill. Frederica, Zika-sama, I accept your consideration with gratitude. At the top floor of the city hall, amidst the busy people, the man Zika Osman had personally brewed her tea, and she accepted it with gratitude. As the soft, warmth-infused scent crept into her nostrils, Frederica could not help but smile. Originally, such a role should have been the responsibility of Frederica, who was a maid. However, Frederica's current position in the empire made her hesitant to engage in the work that had been ingrained in her over the years. Ostensibly, Frederica's role in the empire appeared to be as a guard of dignitaries. In hindsight, since Otto and Garfield's roles were the same, there had been no need for Frederica to leave her role as maid, but it was too late to change things. That was why, accepting the goodwill offered by the commander who, despite being burdened with responsibilities in this place, had personally brewed her tea, she quietly concentrated on gently hydrating her tongue and throat. In fact, as might be expected of him for taking the initiative, Zika's tea brewing ability was quite magnificent. Frederica, for a general of the empire, you seem to be very talented at this kind of thing. Zika, I am honored by your praise. However, I am unable to bear responsibility for the taste of the other general's tea. In my case, I was trained by the many older and younger sisters of my family. Frederica, well. If that is the case, I must thank Zika-sama's esteemed elder and younger sisters. Even in such a hectic situation, we can still enjoy the taste of tea. Zika, indeed, you never know what will be useful in this world. Of course, my enthusiasm in being prepared is more for a beauty like you, Miss Frederica, than for my own family. There was no ulterior motive in Zika's casual repartee, and Frederica naturally accepted his praise. Those words were not falsehoods, perhaps it was the influence of having spent time with so many sisters. His admiration for women was so deep and reverential that it was almost embarrassing. At first, when told that the personage who took the name of the womanizer was the head representative of the city, Frederica had been quite nervous and wary of the situation. Frederica, I would be troubled should something happen to Emily, Lady Petra, or Lady Beatrice. However, that concern had been dispelled upon meeting with Zika in person. The fact that they had been involved in life-saving efforts in the city, which had fallen into turmoil after the devastation of the Flying Dragon cataclysm, probably had some influence, but Zika and the others had willingly taken in Frederica and her group. She was also grateful for Otto's decision to speak with city representatives the moment he arrived in the city. Frederica, I heard that he wooed my Zelda-san as soon as he met her. Otto-sama is truly reliable during times like these. If Otto himself had been listening, he would have said, I think that is somewhat misleading. As his voice quavered, while thinking this, Frederica nodded quietly. Although she thought of him that way, Frederica was helped considerably by Otto's presence. The responsibility of the two senior members of Emilia's group, Frederica and Otto, was quite heavy. After all, Roswal and Ram were off doing something separately. Frederica, in the search for the whereabouts of Subaru and Rem within the Empire, it had been decided that the groups smuggling themselves into the country would split up into two. The split groups consisted of Roswal and Ram, as well as the six including Frederica and the others. After separating from Emilia's group, which was searching for Subaru and his group through steadily asking around, the pair of Roswal and Ram headed for an imperial noble with whom Roswal was acquainted. Frederica had never imagined that his reach extended to the Empire, although Roswal was originally unable to make contact with this person whom he was close with. In any case, with the choice to rely on his acquaintance, Roswal headed there for negotiations, while Frederica and the others began to search for the whereabouts of the two people in a different direction. As a result, the roles of Frederica and Otto had inevitably become more important. Frederica, although Emilia-sama seemed to be rousing herself up to do her best. Frederica's lips parted at the thought of Emilia's enthusiasm, overflowing with motivation and responsibility at the fact that she was the most senior member. If one strictly applied seniority to the Emilia camp, the utmost seniors would be Puck and Beatrice, followed by Emilia. Having been separated from Subaru, it had become difficult for Beatrice to replenish her mana, and she was thus in a state of echo mode to keep her usage within limits, spending most of the day sleeping. That was why Emilia, the next oldest, was inspired to do her best. Of course, the final decision had been left to Emilia, but the discussions leading up to that point had been carefully considered mainly between Frederica, Otto, and Petra. The reason they had traveled to the fortified city was because of a rumor so incredible that she had doubted her ears. Frederica, a rebel army rising against the Empire, and the black-haired maiden who is supporting its ringleader. When Frederica had heard her name was Natsumi Schwartz, she had been unable to grasp its meaning, and her thoughts had come to a complete halt. Frederica had also wondered if someone with the same name as the one she had previously heard of also unexpectedly existed in the Empire. Frederica, if Otto-sama had not recognized the true intention behind it, I wonder if I would have been able to realize it. Ultimately, it had been Otto who had explained that the name of the person being propagated through rumors was a message from Subaru. Otto, after all, that man has a tendency to think that cross-dressing is an all-purpose solution. In fact, I am afraid that it might encourage him to assume that it might be considerably useful. That had been Otto's response, with a face somewhere between exasperation and acceptance. The group had more or less concluded that since Subaru's position was also known in the kingdom of Lagunica, and therefore he had taken measures to avoid having his name brought up within the Wallachian Empire. By the end, only Emilia had been left tilting her head in confusion at the fact that the name of a woman she knew was being used. Why, Natsumi's name? In any case, Zika, it will not be long before Miss Natsumi will be back. Finally, Miss Emily and Miss Petra's wishes will be fulfilled. Frederica, yes, absolutely. Zika gave a nod to Frederica, who was engrossed in her thoughts while enjoying her tea's aroma. Just as he said, their reunion with two people they were searching for, or at the very least, their reunion with Subaru, was expected to come true in the not-too-distant future. Frederica and her friends were correct in assuming that the name Natsumi Schwartz was a message, and Subaru was indeed confirmed to have been present in this fortified city. The problem was that after he had left the city to resolve another matter, another situation had befallen Rem, the other person they were in search of. Zika, if only we had been able to protect Miss Rem. Frederica, that was the extent of the situation. There is no reason to blame you, Zika-sama, nor anybody else. Though, I certainly do regret the outcome. Frederica loosely shook her head at the words of Zika, whose eyes were downcast. When Frederica and the others had arrived at the city, it had not only been Subaru who had been missing, but also Rem. On top of that, Rem had disappeared in the midst of the Flying Dragon cataclysm. It was said that, in order to make the Divine General assailing the city withdraw, she had made herself a hostage. Frederica, as soon as you wake up, I would be convinced that you were Ram's younger sister. While she worried about Rem, Frederica lips spoke of such sentiments. Frederica did not remember Rem, whose name and memories were stolen by the authority of the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony. At least, she had no memories of her being awake. All Frederica knew was what Subaru had told her about Rem's personality and that she looked exactly like her twin sister, Ram. However, it seemed that she was also bold and daring like Ram. Otherwise, she probably would never have been able to negotiate with one of the 9 divine generals and save a city which had its very existence in jeopardy. Frederica, then, having accepted her negotiations, the other party had a reason to keep Rem alive. Having considered it logically, that belief had been their sole salvation. If it had not been for that, Frederica and the others would have immediately pursued the whereabouts of the now missing Rem. Of course, to tell the truth, she still could not help but to want to rush after her. Frederica, if Ram had been there, she would have. No, that girl is clever, she probably would not have done that. It was hard to judge which option Ram would have taken, in the opinion of Frederica, who was well acquainted with her. Ram was wise. But at the same time, she also had a deep love. Frederica knew that she had been visiting her younger sister's room as much, if not more, than Subaru, who visited Rem every night. She had wanted to reunite them. After all, no matter how brash she was, Ram was her beloved protégé. Zika, Miss Frederica, please do not worry too much about it. Conditions in the city have calmed down for the time being. Finally, we can begin to talk about the future. As Frederica gently placed her hand on her chest, Zika spoke as such out of consideration for her. As he said, the claw marks of the flying dragon that attacked the fortified city had finally been sealed, and the conditions were now suitable for discussing what to do in the future. Of course, what happened next would depend on the direction of the discussions, but, General Second Class Zika. It was at the moment Frederica was about to reply to Zika's statement. A sharp voice strained with deep emotion that was something different to being cornered, reverberated through the city hall. Running up the staircase, and rushing towards them was one of Zika's subordinates. Zika turned to him and said, "What is it?" As the man placed his fist in front of his chest, and, "Subordinate, we have a report. Numerous carriages are arriving on the south side of the city, all from the Demon City." Frederica, from the Demon City. Then, involuntarily, Frederica proactively reacted to the report to Zika. Normally, her embarrassment would have outweighed her reaction, but at this moment, that did not bother her in the slightest. Zika nodded deeply at Frederica's enthusiasm, and, "Zika, have they returned?" "As expected, you are an ally with impeccable timing. Call Miss Priscilla, Miss Petra and the others at once." Subordinate, "Yes sir." Frederica's heart pounded at the good news that the person she had been waiting for had returned. Her somber feelings out of concern for Rem's safety had considerably improved from just before. At least for the time being, she thought with this, half of their objectives should have been fulfilled. Zika, everything is well, Miss Frederica. Zika gently smiled at Frederica, who stroked her chest in relief. At his words, Frederica tried to thank him with an indeed, however, subordinate, general second class. The truth is, about that, Frederica's words were interrupted by those of the imperial soldier. Furthermore, as he began to speak with a tinge of unease, Frederica held her breath. Zika seemed to feel the same concern and turned to his subordinate, who had spoken in a low voice, and questioned what's wrong? As the tone of his voice lowered, in response, the subordinate slightly hesitated, and then, "Subordinate, the carriage has returned from the Demon City, but Miss Natsumi Schwartz was not present. They say that they lost track of her whereabouts in Chaos Flame." Indeed, it was a cruel declaration that the twists of fate would continue once more.